The space around the Death Star vibrated with tension. The rebel ships divided into squadrons, performing daring maneuvers as time ticked away. Luke Skywalker, eyes steady and breathing, guided by Obi-Wan's words, aimed at the exhaust port. "Use the Force, Luke," the voice echoed in his mind. He turned off the targeting system, pressed the trigger, but the torpedoes didn't hit the target. The impact was insufficient. A small, superficial, harmless explosion. The Death Star remained intact. Luke Skywalker had missed the target by a hair. The silence on the comm was broken by shouting. "You missed. The shot failed." Luke, paralyzed, felt the weight of the universe crushing him. He had trusted in the Force. He had followed his intuition, and he had failed. In the distance, Darth Vader noticed the mistake and turned his ship toward him. The boy is vulnerable. His fighters followed him, beginning a relentless pursuit. Panic overtook the remaining rebels flying near the superlaser. Hope turned into despair in a matter of seconds. Han Solo, who had already started to pull away with the Millennium Falcon, heard the cries for help. After a moment of hesitation, he turned back. "Hold on, Chewie." His entrance into the fight distracted the TIE fighters just long enough for Luke to escape. But the maneuver came at a high cost. Biggs was shot down, Wedge disappeared into the void, and several pilots died in this failed mission. Han managed to provide cover fire from his ship to save Luke, but the toll was tragic. They had lost the chance to destroy the weapon, and now the price would be paid. The Death Star repositioned in orbit. The superlaser began charging again. On the planet Yavin 4, technicians shouted coordinates, but the expressions on the rebel leaders' faces already showed defeat. Bail Organa tried to calm the young soldiers. When the cannon fired, a beam of pure destruction tore through the darkness of space. In seconds, the rebel base was consumed by light. Yavin 4 was pulverized. Its forests, hangars, records, and all life that existed there were turned to cosmic dust. The pain was felt throughout the galaxy. The emergency transmission, sent seconds before the end, warned, "They failed. Yavin has fallen." Thousands of allies turned off their channels in shock. Some had lost relatives. Others had lost faith. Imperial news broadcasts celebrated the victory with rehearsed triumphs, praising the power of the Empire and the weakness of the terrorists. Vader returned silently to the Imperial base. Without central leadership, the rebellion fragmented. Small cells went into survival mode, hiding in asteroid belts, remote moons, and forgotten planets. Without Yavin 4, there was no longer a headquarters. The hierarchy collapsed. Some senators defected, believing there was no future left. Others, like Leia Organa, barely survived thanks to evacuations carried out by Han and Chewbacca. But even the survivors were shaken. Communications dwindled. Missions became rare. The rebellion became a shadow of what it once was. Luke didn't say a word after returning. He just stared into the void. When questioned, he didn't answer. He slept little, refused food. Guilt consumed him from within. "I missed. I failed everyone." He felt he was no longer worthy of being a rebel, that he had betrayed Obi-Wan's trust. Han tried to cheer him up, but every word was ignored. Leia, even though alive, couldn't reach him. Luke shut himself in a silence more painful than 1,000 wounds. In the days that followed, he began avoiding everyone. His lightsaber remained stored away. At night, he dreamed of Yavin being destroyed. In some visions, he was the one who fired the shot. The guilt blended with doubt. He no longer knew what the Force was. What if it had all been an illusion? What if he had never been the chosen one? With the destruction of Yavin 4, the Empire began to advance with calculated brutality. Smaller rebel bases, which once operated in the shadows, started to be systematically eliminated. Darth Vader led the campaigns with an iron fist. He used not only military force, but also his sensitivity in the Force to track down resistance cells. The Imperial admirals feared him almost as much as the rebels did. The message was clear. There would be no more mercy. The princess remembered that, from space, she saw the base consumed by light, and everyone she knew disappeared. The shock shook her, but did not break her. In the vacuum left by the loss of rebel command, she decided she would not hide. She took it upon herself to gather what remained. With few resources and less than half the structure they once had, Leia began to send coded transmissions on forgotten frequencies. She brought together old allies, loyal traitors, and undercover politicians over time. Even without a fixed base, she formed a network of contacts, a mobile intelligence. Han followed her more out of loyalty than faith, but Leia still believed. Meanwhile, the Imperial High Command met in the palace on Coruscant. The hologram of the Death Star rotated slowly over the meeting table. "We must demonstrate full strength," said General Tarkin. "Not just rebel systems, neutral worlds must see what happens to those who hesitate," replied another. The Death Star, now a symbol of absolute fear, began to be used as political blackmail. Citizens were forced to swear loyalty, governments to surrender resources. The victory was exploited with precision. Luke Skywalker, far from all of this, wandered among forgotten moons. The silence from Obi-Wan had been absolute since Yavin. But one night, in a rocky field, he heard it. "Luke!" The voice was faint, but clear. "You must go on. Go to Dagobah. Seek Yoda." Luke awoke sweating. The message was repeated in visions. Obi-Wan, now part of the Force, appeared guiding the young Jedi once again. He hesitated at first, but with his worn-out X-Wing, Luke set off for a destination no longer found even on maps. The journey was long and lonely. Luke relied on the teachings he remembered: how to calm the mind, how to sense the environment, how to trust intuition. But it was hard. Guilt still gnawed at him. Sometimes he cried in silence. Other times he screamed into the void of nameless planets. But he kept going. While Luke searched for the lost master, Vader became a living symbol. After each massacre, the Empire broadcast his image. The executor of justice, the shadow of order. Rebels spoke his name in whispers. Imperial governors revered him. His brutal methods, his relentlessness, his aura of terror, all of it elevated his reputation. With each conquered system, the hope of the rebellion shrank further. And beside the Death Star, Vader became the true face of the Empire. Rumors said he was immortal. Soldiers who fought against him claimed his strikes could not be anticipated. Ships exploded at simple commands. Officers choked with a single glance. Vader didn't need to shout to command. His presence alone was enough. And even without speaking of the Force, everyone felt that there was something more. The galaxy was being reshaped, and he was the chisel Palpatine used to sculpt the new regime. The dense mist of Dagobah seemed to emanate from the Force itself. Luke's ship landed with difficulty among the roots and muck. Upon exiting, the heavy air made him dizzy, and each step sank into mud. When he finally found Yoda, the Jedi Master made a few jokes with the young man. But when Luke realized it was the Master Yoda himself, he didn't waste time with introductions. Above all others, Yoda was the one who felt the disturbance the most when Yavin was obliterated. Time lost, yes. Too little remains. The training began with rapid orders and brutal exercises. There would be no adjustment phase. Luke would be forged in pain, or he would not be ready for what was to come. Training began before sunrise. Luke was awakened by cracks in the Force and had to develop reflexes using only instinct. Yoda made him walk over unstable branches while balancing stones with his mind, guided only by perception. When he stumbled, the Master didn't help him. Learn to fall, you must, or fall, you will. When a giant animal swallowed him, the Master didn't help him. When Luke fell into quicksand or nests of venomous creatures, the Master didn't help him. The boy had to grow strong. Food was scarce. Fatigue accumulated, but each effort refined his connection to the Force. The planet demanded focus. Every creature, every sound, every shadow taught something. During the most intense training, Yoda hurled increasingly large objects toward Luke Skywalker using the Force. Luke had to distinguish between what was real and what was a hallucination of the swamp itself. In one of these trials, he saw himself surrounded by figures of Imperial soldiers, but when he attacked, he saw he was only cutting branches and rocks. The mistake caused him to fall into a bog. "Attack, the Force does not," said Yoda. "Observe, yes it does. See, you must, young Skywalker." Luke began to understand that his fight was not with the saber, but with his own mind. But the harshest challenge was silent. Yoda took Luke to a cave covered in moss, where the Force was as dense as vapor. There, without a saber, he would face the worst within himself. He saw Leia crying, begging for help as Vader strangled her. Then he saw himself wielding a red saber, leading Imperial troops, with Vader's helmet on his head. When he struck the reflection in the cave's mirror, he saw his own face shatter, and he understood he was capable of the same fall. The light and the dark were both within him. Luke would not leave Dagobah incomplete. Yoda would not allow it. To the end you must go, or all will be lost. When Luke completed his final training, Yoda did not disappear. Instead, he prepared to accompany him. "Alone you must not be. Yours the burden is, yes, but alone you must not remain." Master and apprentice departed together toward the galaxy's last hope. For the first time in decades, Yoda left his exile. He sensed with the help of the Force that the time to act had finally returned, and he would not be left behind in that moment. It would be his final breath. During the hyperspace journey, Yoda, who had remained silent until then, decided it was time to reveal the truth he had kept for decades. As he observed the stars passing through the ship's viewport, he warned Luke that there were important things he needed to know before the final confrontation. Luke turned attentively. Then Yoda began to speak. He talked about Anakin Skywalker, the extraordinary boy who carried both light and dangerous impulses. He explained how the Jedi Order's mistakes contributed to his fall, and how Palpatine's manipulation was crucial in turning the promising young man into the Dark Warrior now known as Darth Vader. He also mentioned Padme Amidala, describing her as a noble and strong figure whose hope for Anakin's redemption remained until her final moments. Luke listened in silence, without interrupting, absorbing every word. It was the first time he heard everything completely and truthfully, not as legend but as testimony. Yoda also spoke of Ben Kenobi, or rather Obi-Wan Kenobi, who was Anakin's master and trained the true Chosen One. Then he spoke of Padme. Upon learning of his mother's existence and the love that surrounded his birth, Luke showed no outward emotion. However, something inside him changed. For the first time, he began to see Vader not just as an enemy or a threat, but as part of a complex story marked by tragic choices. The figure of the villain began to gain human contours, and that touched him deeply. Luke confessed that he could not promise Vader's salvation, but declared he would not fight out of hatred and that, if he destroyed the Sith, it would not be out of malice, but to free him from Palpatine and from himself. His intention was clear: to resist the darkness, even if it came from his own blood. Yoda understood that this kind of stance, based on compassion, not vengeance, was the only real chance to break the cycle. That conversation was more than a revelation. It was a preparation for something greater. Luke would not face just a red saber, but everything that saber represented: pain, loss, choices, and the weight of the legacy he now carried. The ship finally reached a remote asteroid field, where old Alliance sensors detected signs of life. There, in an improvised base carved into the wreckage of downed cruisers, a small group of rebels had managed to remain hidden. Luke and Yoda landed without being immediately detected. When they disembarked, they were received by Leia, Han, and a few soldiers worn down by war. Most were distrustful of everything and everyone, with exhausted eyes and closed expressions. But when they saw Yoda, a real, well-trained Jedi who had endured through time, the legendary figure of the old Jedi Order, something changed. A silent reverence spread, and for the first time in a long time, their gazes lifted. Even without supplies or material hope, that moment returned to the rebellion a spark of what they had lost: the meaning of the fight. At the center of that improvised shelter, among parts of destroyed ships and damaged holographic panels, the plan began to take shape. The strategy would require absolute synchronization. Luke would lead an attack from an alternate route. Leia and Han would infiltrate an auxiliary structure to sabotage the internal defenses. The mission was nearly suicidal, but not impossible. For the first time since the fall of Yavin, there was a real plan to strike back. On the night before the mission, Luke walked alone among the wreckage of ships. He felt the cold of the metal under his feet and the slight vibration of the force around him. There was a balance there, fragile but real. For the first time since missing the shot that could have changed everything, he did not feel crushed by regret. Now, his strength came not from certainty of victory, but from the acceptance of what needed to be done. The rebel fleet gathered in silence at the edge of a hidden system, among asteroid fields and belts of abandoned debris. Luke Skywalker led the squadron of pilots, now composed of scarred veterans and inexperienced youths. 2 ships carried modified bombs, created with what little remained and the ingenuity of the rebellion's engineers. They were unstable devices but powerful enough to completely destroy the Death Star, as long as they were placed in the central compartments. The risk was immense, but everyone knew there would be no second chance. As the Falcon approached the side of the station, Leia and Han exchanged final instructions. Lando coordinated the movement of smaller ships around the station's gravitational field. The Death Star was preparing for another alignment jump, which left internal sections exposed. This was the window they had been waiting for. Tension overtook the communication channel, where few dared to say more than necessary. There was no time for goodbyes, only to execute and hope. Luke and Yoda's task was to keep Vader occupied. If he was in one of the ships, no one would be able to escape his firepower. Inside the station, Luke and Yoda infiltrated through a breach in the shield, guided by the Force and the sacrifice of many of the few ships that re-engaged the enemy. Vader was waiting for them. The duel began in a dark control room, where cables hung from the ceiling and sparks sliced through the air. Yoda no longer moved with his former agility, but his connection to the Force manifested with overwhelming precision. It was Luke who advanced physically, saber in hand, while the Master on his back deflected panels, launched objects, and intercepted Vader's strikes with invisible energy. It was an improbable dance, a fusion of body and spirit. Vader sensed the difference. Luke was more focused, harder to predict. Yoda's presence affected him as well. The words and memories of the old master whispered in his mind, even if left unspoken. But rage was still his fuel, and each blow he landed was more brutal than the last. Luke retreated, felt the weight but endured. Yoda intensified the counterattacks, making the red saber be repelled by subtle pushes and broken balance. The confrontation grew in intensity, while, from within the Death Star's central command, Palpatine watched everything through the monitors. The Emperor, focused on the Force echoes emanating from the battle, ignored the signs of rebel movement. Leia, Han, and Lando had also infiltrated the lower galleries of the station, using a breach discovered by R2-D2 amid the space battle. But something went wrong. They felt the tremors from the exterior of the ship. The second bomb had been destroyed at that very moment, triggering a large detonation, but not one strong enough to significantly damage the Death Star. Then they realized that the bombs had jammed at the triggers. The release system was not working. To ensure the explosion, someone would have to stay behind and activate it manually while the other 2 escaped using an enemy ship. There would be no escape if the plan went forward. Lando hesitated. Han volunteered, and Leia looked at him with deep concern. But the decision was made in silence by all. On the upper levels, the fight between Luke, Yoda, and Vader was still unfolding with violence and fatigue. Time was running out, and the sacrifice was inevitable. With each passing minute, Yoda showed more difficulty. His body trembled, his arms grew heavy, and his expression turned pale. Luke sensed that the Master was reaching his limit. In a decisive moment, Yoda fell, not from a direct blow, but from exhaustion. Luke screamed, catching him in his arms as Vader approached. Without thinking, he destroyed the control panel of the room, causing an explosion that sealed the automatic doors. It was enough to buy time. He ran through the corridors with the nearly unconscious Master and leapt into an auxiliary ship. Inside the internal structure of the Death Star, Leia and Han looked at the bomb panel with a silent decision already made. Lando was trying to convince them, There's still time. You can get out through escape line B12. I can activate it from here. But Leia's eyes didn't waver. Han held her hand. This fight was always ours. Lando embraced them, speechless. He left with teary eyes, while the two prepared to end the galactic terror. In the command center, Palpatine felt something. A sharp disturbance, like a blade cutting through the Force itself. His face tensed. "Show me the footage. We have intruders on the Death Star." The Imperial officers activated the cameras. There they were, Leia Organa and Han Solo. The sight of the couple sparked a rare fury in the Emperor. He would trust no one else with that vengeance and departed personally. The war would not end until he saw the destruction of the last rebel spark with his own eyes. Meanwhile, in the depths of space, Luke was still in combat with Vader. The two starfighters danced among debris, firing beams of light and maneuvering with millimetric precision. Neither of them spoke. Only the blasts did. An alert sounded on Luke's communicator. It was Lando. "Luke, they're going to blow the station. Now, get out of there now." Luke turned his ship, ready to flee, but Vader was on his tail. Every attempt to shake him off was blocked. The advanced TIE was about to strike his hull. That was when the Force manifested again. Yoda, who had weakened during the escape, spoke his final words. "My time has come. Without me, your journey you must continue. Believe you must." And he vanished inside the ship, leaving only his robe behind. But Luke didn't feel alone. A blue glow began to take shape in the cockpit, and there was the Master, now part of the Force. At his side, another figure emerged, Obi-Wan, his first guide. They said nothing, but their presence filled the space with clarity. Luke closed his eyes for a moment, guided only by the Force. His fingers moved instinctively, and then he pulled the trigger. The shot crossed space like a line of pure light. Vader's fighter tried to dodge, but it was too late. The energy pierced the fuselage, hitting the engines. The TIE exploded in red and black flames, spinning away in blazing fragments. Luke opened his eyes to the sound of the destruction, feeling the weight of the moment. He did not celebrate. He only looked at the blue glow beside him and saw the two masters nodding with serenity. The Sith lineage began to crumble there. Palpatine arrived at the hangar just as the countdown lights lit up. He advanced alone, his steps firm in the echo of the metal. In front of him, Leia and Han, embracing, not fleeing, not hesitating. "You have lost," he hissed, but neither replied. They just looked at each other and kissed, a silent kiss that ignored the shadow before them. Palpatine felt true fear for the first time in his life. A moment later, a flash burst from where Han and Leia stood, and space trembled. The core of the Death Star collapsed in a chain reaction. Fire rose through the structures like a devouring wave. The explosion was monumental. White light cut through the darkness of space, and then came the ring of fire, consuming everything in its path. Smaller ships were thrown aside, panels shattered, lights went out around them. Part of the rebel fleet had already begun to retreat, but they were too close. The shields vibrated. A cruiser split in half. Two pilots couldn't escape. Luke, with his ship at maximum speed, activated the final acceleration and flew between two fragments of the station just seconds before the final flash. The survivors watched from a safe distance, floating among the wreckage. The Death Star no longer existed, not as debris but as a symbol. It was as if a contained scream echoed through space. The silence that followed was respectful. No one cheered. No one smiled. They just breathed. Luke watched everything from the cockpit, hands steady on the controls and a distant look in his eyes. He did not think of victory. He thought of those who remained, those who had fallen, and what it all now represented. Yoda and Obi-Wan appeared once again, in their ethereal form. The Force vibrated around Luke. He heard them, not with his ears, but with his heart. They told him that the Sith had been extinguished, that the cycle of darkness had been broken, and that now, finally, the galaxy could begin again. There would be no more burden of hidden empires, no more thrones concealed in shadows. Freedom was not a promise, it was a chance. Luke looked at the remains glowing among the stars. The Force no longer seemed silent, pulsed with balance. The galaxy was not healed, but for the first time in a long time it was alive. The rebel ships began to regroup, each bearing its wounds, its losses, but also its hope. A new era lay before them, and Luke, now fully a Jedi, knew that the hardest part still lay ahead, building peace. But that, at last, was possible, because fear was gone, and the future, though uncertain, was free.